Well, howdy everyone, my name's Chris and today I'm looking at the Sigma 17 to 50mm f2.8 OS HSM lens. This is a fast standard zoom lens for APS-C cameras only, which means pretty much any digital SLR that costs under £1,000, and it's especially popular because it has image stabilization. Fast standard zoom lenses are great and a lot of professional photographers have them. They have about the same focal length as your typical Canon 18 to 55mm kit lens, so wide angle to short telephoto. But they have a fast maximum aperture of f2.8, which makes all the difference. An f2.8 aperture lets in almost twice as much light as your typical kit lens at its widest angle, and 4 times as much light when you're zoomed in to 50mm. This extra light is really special. It lets you take more pictures indoors and get faster shutter speeds for sharper pictures. Having more light is also really useful for video work, especially indoors or in the dark. Another great advantage of an f2.8 aperture is that you can get a much blurrier background in your pictures, a more shallow depth of field. Here's a picture taken at f5.6, which is the maximum aperture of a kit lens when it's zoomed in. And here's a picture taken at f2.8. As you can see, there's quite a difference in the background. Another great feature of this lens is that it's image stabilized with Sigma's optical stabilizer. This helps you to get sharper pictures in low light, and it's very useful for keeping your video footage smooth. As you can see here, it's working fine, but it wobbles and jerks a tiny bit as you pan around, so it's not the most well-behaved system. But for still photography, it works great. Let's look at this lens's build quality. The lens manages to stay fairly small in size, especially compared to Canon's version of this lens, the enormous 17 to 55mm f2.8 IS. The Sigma lens feels really solid in your hand and nicely built. The front element is quite large, which looks a little odd, but it helps to keep vignetting down, as you'll see later. The zoom ring isn't quite the smoothest I've ever used, but it certainly works better than a kit lens. The focus ring is quite smooth and quite loose to use. It only turns about 45 degrees, so it has quite a short focus path, which means it isn't always easy to manually focus. But overall, the ring works okay, and focus pulling in video work is quite smooth. The lens does not have full-time manual focusing, so you shouldn't try to move the focus ring while it's set to autofocus. This is a little bit old-fashioned. But the front element doesn't move while you change focus, so that's good news for people who use certain filters. The autofocus is quite fast and very quiet. It also tested very accurately on my Canon 60D. So all in all, the lens is built very nicely, although not quite up to the very highest standards. Let's take a look at the all-important picture quality. We'll start with the lens zoomed out at 17mm and the aperture wide open at f2.8. As you can see, the lens is extremely sharp in the middle, and as we look into the corners, we can see that it remains decently sharp until the very edges. Unfortunately, if you look in the edges of the window frames, you can see there's some green and purple chromatic aberration, which is quite noticeable. So the lens is superb in the middle, but slightly unimpressive in the corners. However, stop down to f4 and we see a big improvement in sharpness and contrast, although the chromatic aberration remains noticeable. f5.6 and f8 are about the same, and of course, the middle of the image remains razor sharp. So overall, a very good, but not perfect, performance at 17mm. Now let's zoom in a bit to 28mm. At f2.8 we see a very similar performance. The lens is excellently sharp in the middle and acceptably sharp in the corners. Happily, the chromatic aberration has cleared up. This is a pretty good show, and at f4 we see another lovely increase in sharpness. Stop down to f5.6 for incredibly sharp corners and a similarly great image in the middle. This is great image quality. And at 50mm, well, boringly enough, we see exactly the same characteristics again, or should I say excitingly, because it's actually a really good performance. The middle of the picture is razor sharp again, and the edges are good, with no chromatic aberration. Stop down to f4 and the corners again become very sharp indeed before reaching perfection, well, what I consider perfection, at f5.6. The middle of the image remains super sharp. So there you have it. The Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS gives a very strong performance indeed in my tests. The corners of its images are not perfect at f2.8, but you'd have to be a tiny bit of a snob to worry about that. This is a very sharp lens indeed. In this picture, you can see that the lens displays the average level of distortion for its class. At 17mm we see medium levels of barrel distortion, which is almost gone at 24mm, turning into slight pincushion distortion at 50mm. You can also see in these pictures that the lens doesn't have any real problems with vignetting or dark corners, so a good performance for vignetting and average for distortion. The Sigma can focus in a little closer than other lenses of its class, so that's always a good thing. Here you can see my tiny little camera clock. The close-up image quality is a little soft at f2.8, but nice and sharp from f4. This is slightly better than average for a fast standard zoom lens. The lens handles work against bright lights fairly well. In this footage you can see a bit of flaring, but the contrast levels remain good. Again, that's an average performance for this type of lens. Finally, the quality of the bokeh, or out of focus areas, is really nice and smooth at 50mm. That's important for a lot of people, so good job Sigma. Even quite difficult backgrounds are rendered fairly well. The bokeh at wider angles is slightly more nervous though, if you look very carefully. But that's really nitpicking. This nice bokeh is great to see because if you're buying a fast lens to get out of focus backgrounds, then you want those backgrounds to look good. So all in all, this lens is a great performer in most ways, and it's never below average in any other way. This is a perfect walk-around lens for video or for stills work, a fun general purpose lens that you could keep on your camera all the time and get great shots. In terms of image quality, it's only slightly behind the very expensive Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS, which is the king of fast standard zoom lenses. But the Sigma only costs about half as much. I got my copy on eBay for only £240. As such, the Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS represents fantastic value for money. I don't think many people will be disappointed with this lens. Highly recommended.